Tom and Emily's seemingly perfect marriage takes a devastating turn when Tom suspects Emily of infidelity. What begins as subtle changes in her behavior spirals into shocking revelations, including secret meetings and an emotional affair with another man. As trust shatters, Tom struggles with heartbreak and rage, questioning whether their love can survive the betrayal. Emily pleads for forgiveness, desperate to prove her commitment. But the journey to reconciliation is fraught with tension, unexpected confrontations, and painful truths. Can their marriage withstand the ultimate test? Or will the cracks in their relationship prove too deep to heal? Watch to find out. It's 2016, in the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood where life seemed as predictable as the sunrise. Among the rows of neatly manicured lawns and mailboxes stood the Reynolds house, a cozy two-story home where 36-year-old Tom Reynolds lived with his wife, Emily. They'd been married for 10 years, a milestone that many of their friends envied. Tom worked as a project manager for a construction firm. He was the kind of man who believed in hard work, loyalty, and the simple pleasures of life. A cold beer on a Friday evening, grilling steaks on the weekend, and watching football with his best friend Dave. Emily, on the other hand, was the more social of the two. At 33, she balanced her time between running a boutique downtown and organizing community events. She was outgoing, beautiful, and had a natural charm that drew people in effortlessly. On the surface, everything about their life screamed perfection. They had their fair share of disagreements, but what couple didn't? Tom often joked that they were like peanut butter and jelly, different but made for each other. But like every relationship, there were cracks beneath the surface that neither wanted to acknowledge. For Tom, those cracks started to deepen on a chilly autumn evening. Tom came home from work later than usual. He dropped his bag by the door, loosened his tie, and called out for Emily. No response. He checked the kitchen, expecting to see her prepping dinner, but the room was eerily quiet. Her car was in the driveway, so he knew she was home. "Em?" he called again as he headed upstairs. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and found Emily sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. She looked startled, as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. Her face lit up with a smile, but Tom couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. "Hey, you're home early," she said, her voice a little too cheerful. "Not really. Everything okay?" he asked, noticing how quickly she slid her phone under a pillow. "Yeah, just tired." "It's been a long day," she replied, standing up and brushing past him. "I'll get dinner started." Tom watched her leave the room, his instincts telling him something was off. Emily had been acting strange for weeks, distant, distracted, and often glued to her phone. He chalked it up to stress from work, but tonight felt different. He shook his head, trying to brush off the nagging feeling. At dinner, Emily was quieter than usual, responding to his questions with short answers. Tom tried to lighten the mood, cracking a joke about the burnt garlic bread, but even that didn't get more than a faint smile from her. After they ate, she excused herself, saying she needed to catch up on some emails for the boutique. Tom decided to clean up the kitchen, but his mind was racing. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he couldn't ignore the shift in her behavior. Something was bothering her, and for the first time in their marriage, he felt like she wasn't letting him in. The next morning, Tom brought it up over breakfast. "You've been quiet lately," he said, trying to sound casual. "Is everything okay?" Emily looked up from her coffee, her expression unreadable. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a lot on my plate right now." "Is it the boutique? You know you can talk to me, right?" "I know," she said, offering him a small smile. "It's nothing really." But it didn't feel like nothing. Tom decided not to press her, hoping she'd open up in her own time. He spent the rest of the day working on a DIY project in the garage. but Emily's evasiveness lingered in the back of his mind. That evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Emily's phone buzzed. She grabbed it quickly, glancing at the screen before setting it down. Tom couldn't help but notice the slight flush on her cheeks. She didn't get many messages this late, and when she did, it was usually from her sister or one of her friends. But this time, she didn't offer any explanation. "Who's texting you?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "Just Lisa," she said, referring to her best friend. "She's asking about the fundraiser next weekend." Tom nodded, but the feeling of unease returned. Emily's phone buzzed again, and she shifted in her seat, positioning the screen away from him. He didn't say anything, but his mind was already piecing together scenarios, each one worse than the last. Over the next few days, Tom's suspicions grew. Emily was spending more time on her phone, often stepping out of the room to take calls or sending texts with an intensity he'd never seen before. When he asked her about it, she brushed it off, claiming it was work-related, but her explanations felt rehearsed, and the distance between them only widened. One evening, Tom decided to confide in Dave. They were sitting on the back porch, beers in hand, as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Do you think I'm being paranoid?" Tom asked after explaining the situation. Dave took a long sip of his beer before responding. "I don't know, man. It could be nothing, but it's worth paying attention to. Sometimes, people just go through phases. Maybe she's stressed and doesn't know how to talk about it." "Yeah, maybe," Tom said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. As the days turned into weeks, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emily's behavior didn't improve, and her excuses became less convincing. One night, while she was asleep, he found himself staring at her phone on the nightstand. A part of him felt guilty for even considering it. But the other part, the part that was tired of second-guessing everything, told him he needed answers. He reached for the phone, his heart pounding. It was locked, and he didn't know the passcode. He placed it back carefully, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. If he wanted the truth, he'd have to find another way. The following weekend, Emily told Tom she was heading to a friend's house to help with some fundraiser planning. She left in a rush, barely making eye contact as she kissed him goodbye. Tom decided to follow her, a decision that made his stomach churn with guilt, but felt necessary. He trailed her car at a safe distance, his palms sweaty as he gripped the steering wheel. When she pulled into a cafe parking lot, he parked a few spots away and watched as she got out of the car. To his surprise, she wasn't alone. A man stepped out of another car and greeted her with a hug, a little too long to be friendly. Tom felt his chest tighten as he watched them walk into the cafe together. He didn't know who the man was, but the way Emily smiled at him was a look he hadn't seen in months. It wasn't just her behavior that had changed, it was her entire demeanor. He sat in the car, torn between confronting her and driving away. His heart told him to march into the cafe and demand answers, but his head told him to wait. If he acted impulsively, he might never get the full story. When Emily returned home later that evening, she acted as if nothing had happened, but Tom couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed. The image of her with the stranger played on a loop in his mind, fueling his suspicions and deepening the rift between them. Tom couldn't ignore the tension building within him. That moment in the cafe had taken up permanent residence in his mind. The man's face was etched into his memory, and worse, Emily's laughter, effortless and free, played like a broken record. He hadn't heard her laugh like that in months, maybe even years. It stung, and the sting only grew as he grappled with his next move. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but what else could it be? Maybe Dave was right. Maybe this wasn't an affair, but something else. Yet deep down, Tom couldn't shake the thought that Emily had been slipping away from him. The following days brought little relief. Emily remained distant, her phone always in her hand or face down on the counter. The warmth in her smile when she greeted him felt like a shadow of what it once was. Tom tried to focus on his work, but every conversation, every glance at her, only fueled the questions in his mind. Who was that man? How long had this been going on? And most painfully, why? One evening, Tom decided to break the silence. "Emily, we need to talk." She looked up from her laptop, her expression unreadable. "About what?" Tom hesitated. He didn't want to come off as paranoid, but the weight of unspoken thoughts was unbearable. "About us. About what's been going on lately." Emily closed her laptop and leaned back, crossing her arms. "What do you mean?" "You've been different," he said, choosing his words carefully. "You're distracted all the time, and it feels like we're barely even talking anymore." She sighed, her gaze falling to her hands. "Tom, I've just been stressed. The boutique is more demanding than I expected, and these community events are taking up a lot of my energy. It's nothing personal." "It doesn't feel like nothing," Tom pressed. "I saw you at the cafe last weekend. You didn't mention you were meeting anyone." Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "You followed me? Is that really the issue here?" Tom shot back, frustration bleeding into his tone. She hesitated, her expression softening into something between guilt and sadness. "Tom, I swear, it's not what you think." "That was Daniel, a vendor I'm working with for the fundraiser. We were just discussing logistics. Logistics that required hugs and private meetings." Tom's voice cracked slightly, the hurt seeping through despite his best efforts to contain it. Emily ran a hand through her hair, clearly exasperated. "You're being ridiculous. I'm allowed to meet people without giving you a full rundown." "It's not about the meeting, Emily," Tom said, his voice quieter now. "It's about how distant you've been. I feel like I don't even know what's going on in your life anymore." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up, her movements deliberate, and walked to the window. For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but silence and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way." Tom wanted to believe her, but the ache in his chest told him this conversation was far from over. They went to bed that night with a chasm between them, one that neither seemed ready to cross. The days that followed were marked by a strained politeness. Emily tried to act normal. She'd make his favorite dinner, laugh at his jokes, and even initiate conversations about his day. But Tom saw through it. It was forced, and he couldn't stop wondering what she was hiding. One night, Tom's opportunity came. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, her phone loosely clutched in her hand. Tom hesitated. He hated the idea of snooping. It felt like a betrayal of the trust they were supposed to have. But then he thought of the man in the cafe, and the laughter that hadn't been meant for him. His resolve hardened. He gently lifted the phone from her hand and unlocked it. His heart pounded as he scrolled through her messages. Most were innocuous, chats with Lisa, her sister, and boutique staff. But then he saw a thread with D. His thumb hovered over it, his breath hitching. When he finally opened it, his worst fears were confirmed. The messages were friendly, but overly familiar. Inside jokes, shared emojis, and references to moments that clearly hadn't involved Tom. One particular line made his stomach drop. "I can't wait to see you again." Tom's hands shook as he placed the phone back in its original position. He didn't wake her. Instead, he sat in the dark, staring at nothing as the betrayal sank in. It wasn't a full-blown confession of an affair, but it was enough to destroy the trust he'd held onto. The next morning, Emily noticed the change in him immediately. He was cold, distant, and avoided her eyes. When she asked if something was wrong, he simply shrugged. Over the next few weeks, their relationship spiraled. Tom didn't confront her directly. Part of him hoped she'd come clean on her own, but she didn't. Instead, she continued her facade, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. The tension became unbearable, and Tom found himself confiding in Dave again. "Man, you've got to talk to her," Dave said. "You can't just let this fester. Either she's cheating, or there's some other explanation. But you won't know unless you ask." "I did talk to her," Tom muttered. "She just danced around the truth." "Then you've got to be direct, lay it all out on the table." Tom nodded, though the thought of another confrontation filled him with dread. He knew Dave was right. He couldn't live like this, half in the dark, half clinging to a hope that felt more fragile by the day. That evening, Tom prepared himself. He rehearsed what he would say, how he'd approach it. But when the moment came, all his preparation went out the window. "Emily," he said, his voice shaking, "I need to know the truth. Are you seeing someone else?" Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then her shoulders slumped, and she put the fork down. "It's not what you think," she said softly. "I haven't done anything physical, but She stopped, struggling for the words. "But you what?" Tom demanded, his voice rising. "I've been talking to Daniel," she admitted. "It started out innocent, but I guess I got caught up. He made me feel special." Tom felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. He stood up, pacing the room as the words sank in. "Special? Are you kidding me, Emily? What about us? What about me?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I never stopped loving you, Tom. I felt like we'd lost something." "And your solution was to find it with someone else?" Emily sobbed harder, but Tom didn't comfort her. He felt too betrayed, too angry. That night, he slept in the guest room, leaving her alone to grapple with her guilt. As Tom stared at the ceiling, he realized the next step was the hardest one. Could he forgive her? Could their marriage survive this? He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same. If you've been hooked by this story so far, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Let us know in the comments what you think Tom should do next. Tom's world felt like it was crumbling. Emily's confession lingered in his mind, echoing every time he tried to find clarity. She claimed it hadn't been physical, but was that supposed to make it easier? To Tom, emotional betrayal felt just as devastating. He'd spent nights tossing and turning, trying to decide whether to stay and rebuild or walk away entirely. The days following her confession were tense. Conversations were clipped, and their once cozy home now felt like a battleground. Emily tiptoed around him, trying to make amends with kind gestures, cooking his favorite meals, leaving sweet notes. But it felt hollow. The damage was done, and Tom wasn't ready to let it go. One evening, as Tom sat alone in the guest room, staring at the wall, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Dave. "You good? Let me know if you want to grab a beer or something." Tom sighed, appreciating the support, but feeling too drained to respond. He set the phone down and ran his hands through his hair. He needed space, clarity, and answers, not from Dave, but from Emily. He stood and walked to the master bedroom, where she was curled up on the bed, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, startled, as he entered. "We need to talk," Tom said, his voice firm. Emily nodded, setting her phone aside. "I've been waiting for you to say that." Tom sat at the edge of the bed, careful to maintain some distance. "I need to know everything. No more half-truths, no more sugarcoating. If we have any chance of fixing this, I need the full story." Emily took a deep breath, tears already welling up in her eyes. "It started a few months ago, I met Daniel at a networking event for the boutique. He was charming, attentive, and he noticed me. I didn't mean for it to happen, Tom. I swear I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray you. Tom's jaw tightened. But you did. Even if it wasn't physical, you let someone else into our marriage. Why was I not enough? Emily's tears spilled over as she shook her head. It wasn't about you not being enough. It was about me. I felt invisible. Like I'd lost who I was outside of being your wife and running the boutique. And when Daniel showed interest, She broke off, struggling to continue. Tom's chest ached, but his anger refused to dissipate. So, what now? Is he still in the picture? No, Emily said quickly. I ended it. I told him I couldn't keep talking to him. I chose you, Tom. I want to fix this. Tom stared at her, searching for any sign of deceit. She looked sincere, but how could he trust his instincts now? Fixing this won't be easy, he said finally. I need time, and I need you to prove to me that this marriage is your priority. I will, Emily said, her voice steady despite her tears. I'll do whatever it takes. The next few weeks were a rollercoaster. Emily threw herself into repairing their relationship. She started going to therapy on her own and suggested couples counseling for the two of them. Tom reluctantly agreed, though he wasn't sure if talking to a stranger would heal the gaping wound in their marriage. Their first counseling session was awkward. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, began by asking them to describe what brought them there. Emily spoke first, detailing her feelings of invisibility and the mistakes she'd made. Tom listened, his arms crossed, offering only occasional nods. When it was his turn, Tom didn't hold back. I feel like I've been blindsided. Like everything I thought I knew about my wife and our marriage has been a lie. I don't know if I can trust her again. Dr. Patel nodded, her expression empathetic. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and rebuilding it after a breach is one of the hardest things to do. But it's possible, if both of you are committed. Emily reached for Tom's hand, but he didn't take it. The session ended with both of them feeling raw, but slightly hopeful. It was a small step, but it was something. As they left the therapist's office, Emily turned to Tom. Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy. Tom sighed. It's not about easy. It's about figuring out if there's anything left to save. Emily's face fell, but she nodded. I understand. Over time, the sessions began to help. They learned to communicate more openly, expressing their fears and frustrations without immediately going on the defensive. Emily admitted to the depth of her loneliness. And Tom acknowledged that he'd taken their relationship for granted in some ways. Slowly, they began to rebuild, but it wasn't all progress. There were setbacks, moments when Tom's anger flared up unexpectedly, or when Emily felt crushed under the weight of her guilt. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Tom stormed out of the house and drove aimlessly for hours. He ended up at Dave's house, where he finally let his guard down. I don't know if I can do this, Tom admitted, his voice cracking. I love her, but every time I look at her, I see him. Dave handed him a beer and sat beside him. You've got to figure out what you want, man. If you think there's a chance, even a small one, that you can forgive her, you owe it to yourself to try. But if you can't, don't string yourself, or her, along. Tom nodded, though the clarity he sought still felt out of reach. He stayed at Dave's that night, needing the space to think. The next morning, Tom returned home to find Emily in the kitchen, a nervous look on her face. I was worried about you, she said softly. I needed some time, Tom replied, his tone neutral. I get it, she said, looking down. But I'm glad you're here. I've been thinking, and I want to make something clear. I'm not giving up on us. I know I hurt you, And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness right now. But I'll keep fighting for this marriage as long as you're willing to try." Her words hit Tom harder than he expected. He didn't respond immediately, but he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Emily's actions began to match her words. She was transparent about her schedule, deleted Daniel's number, and offered Tom access to her phone. She even planned a weekend getaway for the two of them, hoping to reconnect outside the weight of their daily lives. As they sat by a crackling fire at a cabin in the mountains, Tom looked at Emily and saw a glimmer of the woman he'd fallen in love with. It wasn't perfect, and the pain hadn't disappeared. But for the first time, he thought maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Tom and Emily's weekend in the mountains was a temporary reprieve, a glimpse of what their life could look like if they managed to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But as they returned home, reality rushed back in like a tidal wave. For every step forward, there seemed to be a new reminder of the damage done. One evening, as Tom was sorting through the mail, he found an envelope addressed to Emily. It was handwritten, the return address unfamiliar. He froze, the sharp sting of suspicion gripping him once again. After staring at it for what felt like an eternity, he handed it to her without a word. Emily took the envelope, her face betraying a flicker of unease. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the single sheet inside. Tom watched her expression shift. First confusion, then a flash of recognition, and finally, panic. "What is it?" Tom demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. It's nothing," Emily stammered, quickly folding the paper and tucking it back into the envelope. "Don't lie to me, Emily," Tom said, his patience wearing thin. "What does it say?" Emily hesitated, her hands trembling. "It's from Daniel," she admitted. "He's trying to reach out." Tom felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "What does he want?" She sighed, her voice heavy with frustration and guilt. "He says he regrets how things ended. He wants to talk." Tom clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up inside him. "And what are you going to do about it?" "I'm not going to respond," Emily said firmly. "I told you, Tom. I chose you. I don't want anything to do with him." "Then why didn't you just show me the letter?" Tom's voice cracked, the pain evident. "Because I knew it would hurt you," Emily said softly. "I didn't want to cause more damage." Tom shook his head, his trust in her faltering once again. "You don't get to decide what I can or can't handle, Emily. That's not how this works." The incident set them back weeks of progress. Tom found himself questioning everything again, while Emily grew increasingly frustrated, feeling like she was fighting a losing battle. Their counseling sessions became more tense, filled with long silences and bitter arguments. The breaking point came one evening when Tom overheard Emily on the phone. She was in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. The paranoia he'd been trying to suppress took over, and he couldn't stop himself from confronting her. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, startling her. Emily turned, her face pale. "It's Lisa," she said quickly, holding up her phone. "We're talking about the fundraiser." Tom didn't believe her. "Let me see." "Tom, this is ridiculous." "Let me see the phone, Emily," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. Reluctantly, she handed it over. Tom scanned the call history, and sure enough, it was Lisa's number. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, but his anger didn't dissipate. "This is what you've done to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't even trust you when you're talking to your best friend." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I know and I hate it. But what else can I do, Tom? I'm doing everything I can to fix this, but you won't let me. Because every time I think I'm moving on, something else happens." "Like that letter," Tom shot back. Emily stepped closer, her voice pleading. I didn't ask for that letter, Tom. I didn't ask for any of this. But I'm here, fighting for us. I need you to fight too. Tom didn't respond. Instead, he walked out the door, needing space to clear his head. He drove aimlessly for hours, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, sadness, and confusion. How could he forgive her when every interaction felt like a reminder of her betrayal? But how could he walk away when he still loved her? The next morning, Emily made a bold decision. She showed up at Tom's office, a small stack of papers in her hands. He looked up, surprised to see her there. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I brought something for you," she said, setting the papers on his desk. "It's everything, every message, every email, every detail of my interactions with Daniel. I don't want there to be any secrets between us anymore." Tom stared at the stack, conflicted. Part of him wanted to read every word, to confirm that there was nothing she hadn't told him, but another part of him was terrified of what he might find. "I'll leave it here," Emily said, sensing his hesitation. "Read it or don't. It's up to you. But I need you to know that I'm committed to earning back your trust." With that, she left, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts. He didn't touch the papers for hours, afraid of what they might reveal. But eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He flipped through the pages, his heart racing as he read through the timeline of her interactions with Daniel. There were moments that stung, inside jokes, flirty exchanges, but nothing that indicated a deeper betrayal. It was painful, but it was also strangely relieving. She hadn't lied. She'd told him everything. When Tom returned home that night, Emily was sitting on the couch, nervously fiddling with her wedding ring. He sat beside her, the weight of the papers still heavy in his mind. "I read it," he said simply. Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "And?" "And I believe you," Tom admitted, his voice soft. "But this doesn't fix everything, Emily. It's going to take time." "I know," she said, reaching for his hand. "But I'm not giving up on us, not ever." As they sat in the quiet of their living room, holding hands for the first time in weeks, Tom felt the tiniest flicker of hope. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. Tom and Emily's fragile progress faced its toughest test, yet when an unexpected event shattered the tentative peace they had begun to rebuild. It was a Thursday evening, and Tom had just finished a long day at work. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed a car parked across the street. It wasn't one he recognized, but he didn't think much of it until he stepped inside. Emily was in the living room, pacing nervously. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she reached for it with shaky hands. Tom's stomach churned. The same unease he'd felt months ago returned in full force. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone wary. Emily froze, clutching her phone. "It's nothing," she said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Tom stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me, Emily, who's texting you?" She hesitated before answering. "It's Daniel." Tom's heart sank, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "What does he want?" "He's outside," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says he needs to talk to me." Tom's fists clenched as he struggled to process her words. "He's here right now?" Before Emily could respond, there was a knock at the door. The sound sent a jolt through both of them. Tom's mind raced with possibilities. What could Daniel possibly want after everything? And why had Emily let this situation escalate to the point where he was standing on their doorstep? Without waiting for Emily to act, Tom marched to the door and flung it open. There stood Daniel, a confident yet slightly apprehensive expression on his face. Tom's fury flared at the sight of him. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here," Tom growled. "I just want to talk," Daniel said, his tone calm but firm. "To both of you." "There's nothing to talk about," Tom snapped, his voice rising. "You've already done enough damage." "Tom, please," Emily said from behind him, her voice shaking. "Let's hear what he has to say." Tom turned to her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I need closure," Emily said softly. "For both of us." Reluctantly, Tom stepped aside, allowing Daniel into the house. The air was thick with tension as they all sat down in the living room. Tom sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, his glare fixed on Daniel, while Emily perched on the armrest, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel was the first to speak. "I owe you both an apology," he began, his gaze shifting between them. "I crossed a line I never should have, Emily. I'm sorry for putting you in this position. And Tom, I'm sorry for disrespecting your marriage." Tom's jaw tightened. "You think an apology makes up for the mess you've caused?" "I'm not here to make excuses," Daniel said. "I just needed to say my piece and let you both know that I'm stepping away. I won't contact Emily again." Emily let out a shaky breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said quietly. Tom wasn't ready to forgive or forget. "You should have stayed away in the first place." "I know," Daniel admitted, "and I regret not doing that. I wish you both the best." With that, he stood, offering a nod before heading toward the door. Tom followed him, his anger still simmering. As Daniel stepped outside, Tom couldn't resist a parting shot. "If I ever see you near my wife again, you'll regret it." Daniel didn't respond, simply walking to his car and driving away. Tom slammed the door and turned to Emily, his chest heaving with emotion. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. "I didn't ask him to come here," Emily said, her voice pleading. "I didn't even know he was going to show up." "But you let him in," Tom said, his voice tinged with betrayal. "You gave him the chance to say whatever he wanted." "I thought it would help," Emily said. "I thought if we could get closure, we could move on." Tom ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "And did it help?" Emily hesitated before nodding. "I think it did. I feel like I can finally put it behind me." "Well, I'm glad one of us feels that way," Tom said bitterly, walking past her to the kitchen. Emily followed him, her voice desperate. "Tom, please don't let this undo everything we've worked for. I didn't want him here, but now that he's gone, we can move forward." Tom leaned against the counter, his head bowed. He wanted to believe her, to trust that this was the final chapter in the nightmare they'd been living. But his emotions were too raw, his wounds too fresh. "I need time," he said finally, his voice heavy. "I can't just pretend like this didn't happen." "I understand," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "But I'm not giving up. I love you, Tom. I'm going to keep fighting for us." Tom didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. That night, they slept in separate rooms, the distance between them more palpable than ever. In the days that followed, the fallout from Daniel's visit hung over their home like a dark cloud. Tom threw himself into work, staying late at the office and avoiding Emily as much as possible. Emily, meanwhile, focused on their therapy sessions, hoping to regain some semblance of normalcy. Their counselor, Dr. Patel, encouraged them to confront their feelings head-on. "You've both been through a traumatic experience," she said. "But if you're committed to rebuilding your relationship, you have to face the pain together." During one particularly emotional session, Tom finally let his guard down. "I don't know if I can ever fully trust her again," he admitted. "But I still love her. And that's what makes this so damn hard." Emily reached for his hand, her eyes filled with tears. "I love you too, Tom. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I'm worthy of your trust." It was a turning point for them, a moment where they both acknowledged the depth of their pain, but also their desire to move forward. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, they felt like they were on the same page. As they left the therapist's office, Tom took Emily's hand in his. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of surprise and hope. "Does this mean—" "It means I'm not giving up either," Tom said. "But it's going to take time." Emily nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Tom and Emily's fragile reconciliation faced its most severe test when a seemingly ordinary event turned into a moment of revelation that neither of them could have anticipated. It started on a quiet Saturday morning. Tom had taken the day off from his usual weekend errands to spend time at home, an effort to bridge the gap that still lingered between them. Emily suggested they clean out the attic together, a task that had been postponed for years. As they sifted through old boxes, laughing at forgotten memories and cringing at dated fashion choices, it felt, for the first time in a long while, like the weight between them had lifted. Emily pulled out a dusty photo album, sitting cross-legged on the wooden floor as she flipped through the pages. "Remember this?" she asked, pointing to a photo of them at the beach, both sunburned but smiling. Tom leaned over, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, that was our first vacation together." For a moment, they were transported back to simpler times, but the tranquility shattered when Tom opened a box labeled Emily's work inside. Amidst stacks of business papers and old receipts, he found a folder with Daniel's name scrawled on the tab. His chest tightened as he pulled it out. "What's this?" Tom asked, holding it up. Emily froze, her face draining of color. "I didn't know that was in there." Tom's heart raced. "Didn't know or didn't want me to find it?" "It's nothing," Emily said quickly. "Just some notes from when we were working together." "Notes?" Tom opened the folder before she could stop him. Inside were printed emails, scribbled meeting notes, and a few candid photos of Daniel taken during events. But the worst was a handwritten letter, dated months before everything had come to light. Tom scanned the letter, his pulse pounding in his ears. Daniel's words were intimate, filled with sentiments of admiration and longing. He wrote about their connection and how he felt Emily was hiding her true feelings. The final line was the dagger. "I'll wait as long as it takes for you to admit the truth to yourself." Tom stood, the folder falling to the floor. "You kept this?" Emily scrambled to her feet. "I didn't mean to. I forgot it was even there, Tom." "You forgot? How do you forget something like this?" His voice was loud enough to echo off the attic walls. Emily reached for him, her voice pleading. "Tom, please." "It didn't mean anything. I never felt the way he did. I swear." "Then why keep it?" Tom demanded, his voice raw with emotion. "Why hold on to something so toxic?" "I don't know," Emily cried. "Maybe I was afraid to let it go. Maybe I felt like I needed to remind myself why it was a mistake. But it's not what you think. It was never about him, Tom. It's always been about us." Tom shook his head, stepping back as the walls of the attic seemed to close in around him. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Emily." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Emily's breath hitched as tears streamed down her face. "Please don't say that we've come so far. Don't let this ruin everything." Tom's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, but his jaw was set. "I need some air." Without waiting for her response, he left the attic and walked out of the house. The crisp autumn air hit him like a wake-up call, but it did little to calm the storm inside him. He walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, his thoughts racing. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder to take. When he finally returned home hours later, the house was silent. Emily was sitting in the living room, staring at the folder, her eyes red and puffy. She looked up as he entered, but neither of them spoke for a long moment. "I threw it away," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "The folder, the letter, all of it, it's gone." Tom nodded but didn't respond. "I know that doesn't fix anything," she continued. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to letting go of the past. I just hope you can do the same." Tom sat across from her, his expression unreadable. This isn't about a letter, Emily. It's about trust. And right now, I don't know if I'll ever trust you again. Her face crumpled, but she didn't look away. I'll keep fighting for us, Tom, even if it takes the rest of my life. The days that followed were tense, but quieter. Tom threw himself into work, spending longer hours at the office to avoid the suffocating atmosphere at home. Emily continued attending therapy, often asking Tom to join her, though he declined. Their conversations became sparse, reduced to logistical exchanges about bills or groceries. Then, one evening, a call from Dave changed everything. Tom was in his office, reviewing contracts, when his phone buzzed. "Hey man," Dave said, his tone unusually serious. "I just saw Daniel." Tom's grip on the phone tightened. "What are you talking about?" "I was at a bar downtown and he was there. He was talking about Emily, Tom, about how he's still waiting for her." Tom's blood ran cold. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Dave said. "I didn't want to say anything, but I thought you should know." Tom hung up, his hands trembling. The fragile resolve he'd built over weeks shattered. He stormed into the living room, where Emily was reading on the couch. "I just got a call from Dave," he said, his voice like steel. "He saw Daniel. And apparently, he's still waiting for you." Emily's eyes widened in shock. "What?" "That's not true. I haven't spoken to him since he came to the house." "Then why is he still talking about you?" Tom demanded, his voice rising. "Why does he think there's still a chance?" "I don't know," Emily cried, standing. "I haven't done anything to encourage him, Tom. I've been here, with you, trying to fix this." "Maybe you think you've been trying," Tom said, his voice trembling with anger. "But it's not enough. None of this is enough." Emily's face fell, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. "So what now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Are you giving up?" Tom hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he expected. He didn't answer, instead retreating to the guest room, where he sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The ache in his chest was almost unbearable, a mix of love, anger, and an overwhelming sense of loss. The next morning, Tom found Emily sitting at the kitchen table, a packed suitcase by her side. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "I think we need some space," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Maybe that's the only way we'll figure out if we can move forward." Tom stared at her, his heart breaking all over again. "Emily, I love you," she interrupted. "But I need to know if you can love me again." She picked up her suitcase and walked out the door, leaving Tom alone in the silence of their once happy home. Tom spent the days after Emily's departure in a fog, each moment heavier than the last. The house felt cavernous and cold without her presence. For all the pain they had endured together, her absence felt like an entirely different kind of loss. He went about his routines on autopilot, but the emptiness gnawed at him. Late one evening, while flipping through old photos on his phone, Tom stumbled upon a video of them from a few years ago. They were hiking, laughing breathlessly as they climbed a steep trail. The joy on their faces was infectious, and for the first time in weeks, Tom smiled. But the smile quickly faded as reality set back in. How had they fallen so far from that happiness? He knew he had to make a choice: hold on to his anger and risk losing her forever, or find a way to heal, both for himself and for their relationship. The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. A week later, Tom reached out to Emily. His message was simple. "Can we talk?" Emily responded quickly, agreeing to meet at a park halfway between their house and the hotel she'd been staying at. When Tom arrived, he found her sitting on a bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked nervous, but determined. "Thanks for meeting me." Tom said as he sat beside her. Emily nodded. I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you. Tom took a deep breath. I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about everything that's happened. And? Emily prompted, her voice hesitant. I'm still hurt, Tom admitted, but I realized something. I've been so focused on my pain and my anger that I forgot why I was fighting so hard in the first place. It's because I love you, Emily, and I want to believe we can find a way back to each other. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I've been hoping you'd say that I know I've made mistakes I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I love you, Tom. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. They talked for hours, more honestly and openly than they had in months. For the first time, they both laid everything bare. No more half-truths, no more assumptions. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without tears. But by the end of the conversation, they both felt a glimmer of hope. In the weeks that followed, Tom and Emily took things slowly. They returned to therapy, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. Emily focused on rebuilding Tom's trust, while Tom worked on letting go of his anger. It was a process, filled with setbacks and small victories, but they were committed to moving forward together. One evening, as they cooked dinner side by side, Tom turned to Emily with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about that hike we took a few years ago, the one where we couldn't stop laughing at how out of shape we were? Emily smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. All the time, it's one of my favorite memories. Mine too, Tom said. I was thinking, maybe we could plan another hike, start making new memories. Emily's smile widened. I'd like that. As they stood there, the scent of garlic and herbs filling the kitchen, Tom realized that for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. Their journey wasn't over, and there would still be challenges ahead, but they were facing them together. Months later, Tom and Emily found themselves on a trail, the sun shining down as they climbed steadily upward. They were both out of breath, but their laughter echoed through the trees. When they reached the summit, they stood side by side, taking in the breathtaking view. This feels good, Emily said softly, being here with you. It does, Tom agreed. He reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. I'm glad we didn't give up. Emily squeezed his hand, her smile radiant. Me too. As they stood there, the past felt like a distant memory, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. They had faced the storm, and though it had tested them in ways they never imagined, it had also made them stronger. If you enjoyed this story and want more captivating recaps, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Let me know in the comments what you thought about Tom and Emily's journey. Would you have made the same choices? Until next time, take care and treasure the ones you love.